So one of the most important aspects of natural language processing is how it is related to the study of linguistics or language. So in the next segment, I'm going to go over the basics of language and language analysis and linguistics as they relate to this class. So linguistics is the study of language, and it covers many aspects of language. For example, its sound system, its syntactic system, its use, its change over time. Let me start now by showing you some slides that relate to the sounds of the language. So the first chart is the IPA, or International Phonetics Association chart of consonants. So each consonant sound can be characterized by two properties. One is the so-called place of articulation, which organs or which portions of organs are used to produce it. And one is the manner of articulation, which is the way in which the air goes through your mouth and nose to pronounce that sound. So let's look at some examples. The first column includes the sounds like p, b, and m, which are known collectively as bilabials. Bilabial stands for two lips. You use both lips to pronounce p, b, m. You also have sounds that are pronounced, for example, with your soft palate, like velar sounds like k and g and ang. And you also have alveolar sounds and palatal sounds and uvular sounds. Uvular is sounds are pronounced using the uvula, which is this little portion of your palate all the way in the back. Now, the manner of articulation can be plosive, like you have a flow of air that suddenly stops when you say it sounds like p, b, t, d, k, g. It can also be nasal if it goes through the nose, like the m, and ng sounds. And it can also be fricative if there is friction when it's pronounced. For example, that covers the sounds like v, v, s, z, sh, and j. And the third property of consonants is whether they're voiced or voiceless. So for example, in each pair, in each box, you have as many as two different consonants. For example, p and b. They're pronounced exactly the same way as far as the place of articulation and the manner of articulation are concerned, but they differ in whether they are voiced or not. So if you put your finger on your throat and you try to pronounce p and b, you will realize that when you say b, your vocal cords vibrate, and when you say p, they don't. So the same thing applies to all of the pairs of sounds, like t and d, k and g, and sh and j, and so on. Now, in addition to consonants, there can be vowels, and vowels are characterized by two properties again. One is where they're formed in the mouth, the front, the back, or in the middle, and also whether your mouth is open, closed, or somewhere in the middle. So for example, the E sound is a front vowel that is pronounced with a closed, relatively closed mouth, whereas A is much more open than E or A, and it's still pronounced in the front of the mouth. And then sounds like O and U are pronounced in the back of the mouth. So this chart, just like the previous one, includes vowel sounds that are not only in English but in other languages as well. Now, the other thing that you want to hear about linguistics is that languages are related. Not all languages are related to all other languages, but many languages are related to each other. So if you look at this slide here, you will see that the word for night in English is very similar to words in other languages, such as French and German, all the way to Albanian and Latin and Sanskrit. The words don't look exactly the same, but they have the same origin. They come from a language called Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, from which all of the currently existing Indo-European languages originate. So Proto-Indo-European doesn't exist anymore, yet some of the words in that language still survive to these days, like in this example. So let's just look at how different they can be. Night in English, nuit in French, Nacht in German, noche in Russian, nocht in Bulgarian, noite in Portuguese and Galician, notte in Italian, noapte in Romanian, nachts in Latvian. they all look relatively different, and yet they have something in common. They all have the form that starts with the letter N, followed by some vowel, and then some specific consonant or pair of consonants that are somewhat related to each other. So all of the words in this category are known as cognate. So cognate is a term in linguistics that means that words have a common ancestry. So the languages in the Indo-European language family that survive to these days can be grouped into smaller categories. For example, Bengali and Urdu both descend from Sanskrit. Farsi descends from Old Persian, and both Old Persian and Sanskrit are part of the so-called Indo-Iranian group of languages. Greek is a descendant of the Hellenic group of languages. Romanian, French, and Catalan all descend from Latin, which is a form of an Italic language. Lithuanian, Russian, and Polish are all parts of the Balto-Slavic group of languages. Modern English descends from Old English, which is a Germanic language. German descends from Old High German, which is another Germanic language, and so on. There are some non-Indo-European languages that exist in the world. Some of them are even spoken in Europe and nearby countries. For example, Turkish is a non-Indo-European language. It is part of the so-called Altaic family. Finnish and Hungarian are part of the Finno-Ugric family. Arabic and Hebrew are part of the Semitic family, and to cover the rest of the world, there can be also language families from Africa and the Americas, such as Uto-Aztecan, which is spoken in portions of North and Central America. So this chart here shows you a relative distribution of the language families in the world. It's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but you can get the original version from Wikipedia. You can see that there are many different language families and that they're distributed all over the world. And to give an idea of the language diversity that exists nowadays, I would like to refer you to a website called the Ethnologue, which covers 7,300 languages in the world, which are grouped into all those different families that you can see on the screen. You see some of the families can be very large. For example, the Austronesian family has 1,257 languages. So the Austronesian family of languages are languages spoken in Australia and the islands of the Pacific. Other large groups include Sino-Tibetan languages, which include Chinese and related languages. Languages from Papua New Guinea are also very common. In fact, Papua New Guinea is one of the places in the world, along with Indonesia, that has the largest number of different languages. Another subject that linguists study is the change of language over time. So I'll give you some examples here. One specific example is Grimm's law. Grimm's law tells you how words in a wide range of languages changed over the years in a very systematic way. So what used to be voiceless stops turned into voiceless fricatives. What used to be voiced stops became voiceless stops. And finally, what used to be voiced aspirated stops, aspirated are the ones that are pronounced with an aspiration like those changed to either voiced stops or fricatives. So there are two examples here. So example one shows you how one of those changes occurred in a variety of languages. For example, the P sound that appeared in ancient Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit changed into an F sound in English, German, and Swedish. So the word food is listed in all of those examples. The second example is the word for dog, which used to start with the letter K in ancient Greek, Latin, and even in Welsh nowadays, but it has changed in English, Dutch, and German to the sound H. Now is a good time to show you a NACLO problem about related languages and language cognates. The name of this problem is O in the Family, and it was used in the 2012 contest. So when you have time, try to solve this problem, and then on the next slide you will see a link to the solution. So here is the solution to the problem O in the Family, which has to deal with related families of languages and cognates. Now, going back to the idea of language change, I'm going to show you a very ancient piece of text, and I'm going to ask you if you can guess the source of this text, the language, and its period. You will see the solution on the next slide. Well, the answer is that this is Beowulf, which is an epic poem that was written in the 8th to 11th century in Old English. Now, it's a little hard to read the manuscript, so instead what I would do is show you the text in a way that is easier to read. The left-hand side of the slide shows you the text as it appeared in Old English, and the right-hand side shows you an approximate translation into modern English. You can see that even though modern English descended from Old English, it is very different from it, and it's very difficult to recognize most of the words in Old English. Now, I should also say that modern English did not just descend from Old English. It also borrowed many words from related languages such as French and German and so on over the years after that. The only word that is easy to recognize here is still fairly arcane. This is the word erst, as in erstwhile in English. It means first. And that is highlighted in boldface in the middle of each of the two texts. If you're interested in how English changed from Old English to modern English, you can go through the list of links at the bottom of the page. This slide shows you just a few of the examples of the words that used to exist in Old English but are not commonly used these days in modern English or have changed their meanings completely. For example, a settle, S-E-T-T-L-E, used to mean a seat or bench. I mean, nowadays we use the verb to settle, but we don't use settle as a noun, and it certainly does not mean sit or bench. So languages in different families and even languages within the same family can be very diverse. For example, some languages have articles and some don't. This is why native speakers of Russian often have a hard time when they speak English, because there is no concept of an article, words like the and in Russian. So for Russian speakers, it can be sometimes very difficult to say whether you should say, I have an apartment, or you should say, I have apartment. Different languages can also have cases. So a case is an indication that the word can be used in different syntactic roles in the sentence. For example, in Latin, you can have a sentence like the one shown here, puer, puellam, vexat, where puer means a boy, puella means girl, and vexat is a form of the verb to vex or to annoy. So here, the order of the words in the sentence is not really important. What is more important is that the first word, puer, appears in the so-called nominative case, which indicates the subject of the sentence, whereas the middle word, puellam, indicates that puella is in the accusative case, or it's the object of the verb, and finally, vexat is the verb. So here, by combining all this information together, we know that it is the boy who is annoying the girl and not the other way around. In English, the only way to express this is to use word order. In Latin, you can replace the order of those words with a different word order, and you would still get the same semantics, because the meaning of the semantic roles is carried by the endings of the cases. Languages can also differ in their sound systems. For example, some languages have what is known as a glottal stop. So this is the middle sound in so this is something that appears in some of the languages and not in others. There are other sounds that don't exist in English. For example, the so-called velar fricatives. They are articulated with the back of the tongue and the soft palate. So examples of those sounds include the voiceless velar fricative, which is used in languages like Russian, and the voice, which is used in languages such as modern Greek. Both of those don't exist in English. Examples in English would include the two th sounds, the voiceless th and the voiced the, which don't appear in many other languages. And again, that can be a problem for speakers, native speakers of other languages, and that's why sometimes people make fun of the way French people speak when they say this and that, because they're not used to pronouncing the th sound in English properly. Languages can also differ in the way that they refer to people in the structure of a family. For example, Oto-san in Japanese means somebody else's father, and Chichi means somebody's own father. This can be very problematic for an English speaker who goes to Japan and wants to refer to somebody else's father as Chichi. This would be considered rude, or at least a sign that this person is not a native speaker. Kinship systems in general can be very complicated. So English has uncles and aunts and daughters-in-law and so on. But some languages have more than 100 different ways to refer to your relatives. In fact, one of the most complicated kinship systems comes from the language called Warlpiri. And this brings us to the next NACLO problem by Alan Chang, which is listed on this website. If you go and try to solve this problem on your own, you will realize that this language is related to a specific community of people that has different castes, which can intermarry, but then the descendants of people from the different castes can have different names depending on how many generations have happened since the intermarriage. And the solution to this problem is here. The next topic in linguistics that I would like to talk about is the concept of language universals. So those are properties that are valid across all languages in the world. There are two types of language universals, unconditional and conditional. And I'm going to go through some of the examples of those language universals. For example, an example of an unconditional language universal is that all languages have both verbs and nouns, or that all spoken languages have both consonants and vowels. There are no languages that only have consonants or languages that only have vowels. And then two examples of conditional language universals. They both come from Greenberg, who is one of the founders of the theory of language universals. Rule number one on his list is the following. In declarative sentences, those are sentences that end with periods as opposed to question marks and exclamation points. So in declarative sentences with a nominal or noun subject and object, the dominant order is always one in which the subject precedes the object. So if the subject and the object are both nouns, then it's much more common to have the subject precede the object. And rule number 29 on Greenberg's list is, if a language has inflection, it must also have derivation. So what do those words mean? Inflection deals with the fact that you can change a word by changing its morphology and keeping the part of speech. For example, if you take the word to sleep, sleep, and you change it to sleeps, you are inflecting it for the third person. Derivation has to deal with changing the part of speech of a word by changing its morphology. For example, if you take the word drink, you can, which is a noun or a verb, you can change it to drinkable, which is an adjective, by adding a suffix able. So to summarize rule number 29 on Greenberg's list, if a language has inflection, it always has derivation. It's a directional or conditional universal. It doesn't apply in the opposite direction. So one website that I would recommend for you is WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures. It's available online at wals.info. It's a relatively recent project that covers several hundred languages and almost 200 features. The features include things like the order of the object and the verb. It turns out that object precedes verb in 713 languages in the database. Verb precedes objects in 705 cases, and 101 languages don't have any particular dominant order. Some of the other features that are covered in this database are features 18 and 67. So 18 is the absence of common consonants. It turns out that in the database, 5 languages have been enumerated as having no bilabial sounds, 49 have no fricatives, and 12 have no nasals. Rule number 67 is about the inflection of future tense. Let me explain what that means. In English, if we want to express that a certain verb is in the future tense, we need to use an external word like will or shall. So if I want to say, I sleep now, versus I will sleep in the future, I have to add this additional word, I will. Other languages, for example, French or Latin, actually use inflection on the verb, just like we do inflection in English for plural with S or third person for verbs in S. In French, for example, you can add a specific ending to the verb to indicate that it will happen in the future. So based on this feature, it turns out that you can split languages roughly evenly into yes and no categories with about 110 of each. Some of the other websites that I would recommend about word languages are included on this slide. The first one is called Ethnologue. It's a very large website that covers about 7,000 languages in the world. It includes a lot of statistics and examples of their usage. The next site is a very long list of the common number words like 1, 10, 100, and so on in many different languages. And then I would like to use this opportunity to raise the issue of endangered languages. It turns out that there are many languages in the world, about 7,000 of them, but every year a few dozen of them tend to disappear. And by disappear, I mean that the last speakers of that language either die out or stop using that language altogether and switch to a different language. If language extinction continues at this rate, in 100 years, a majority of the world's languages will have died. So there's an effort to save dying languages by preserving records of them in oral and written form, and also by producing technology that will help people who speak or understand those languages to continue to use them. So this was the end of the introduction to linguistics. The next section is going to talk about part of speech.